Most people on television will not tell you what I am about to tell you. Not because they are incapable of seeing it, because once you stop believing the performance loses its power. And the American economy at this moment is running on performance. That is the first thing I want you to understand. It is performing stability. It is performing resilience. It is performing competence. It is performing the reassuring old story that the numbers are mostly fine, the system is bending but not breaking, and the ordinary citizen only needs to be patient a little longer while the experts manage the landing. I do not believe that story. I think the more honest version is harsher and much more useful. The system is not stable, it is supported, it is not healthy, it is managed. It is not broad prosperity. It is selective buoyancy sitting on top of widening fragility. That is what I think the real picture is. And once you see it clearly, a lot of things that looked contradictory stop looking contradictory at all. Stocks can be up while households are breaking. GDP can still print a respectable number while the underlying economy weakens. The official unemployment rate can look tolerable while the job market is quietly freezing. A few areas of the country can feel prosperous while a much larger number of families live in rolling financial triage. That is not confusion, that is structure. And if you do not understand the structure, you will keep hearing the comforting story until the cost of believing it arrives in your own life. I want to begin with one number because numbers, unlike politicians, usually do not flatter you before they hurt you. $39 trillion. That is the national debt of the United States, as described in the source document you gave me. And what matters even more than the size is the speed. The debt crossed $38 trillion in late October of 2025 and then crossed $39 trillion about 5 months later. That is roughly $6 billion of additional borrowing every single day. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn-46, File 0 Fay. Now, people like to say nations borrow. Fine. Countries do borrow. That line is not wrong. It is just useless without the next line. What matters is not merely that debt exists. What matters is what the debt now costs. And here is where the picture turns from large to absurd. For the first time since the founding of the Republic, the federal government paid more than $1 trillion in a single fiscal year, just in interest, not roads, not soldiers, not hospitals, not science, not actual output, just the carrying cost of the existing debt. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn-46, File 0 Fay, that is, the part the public has not metabolized. People hear trillion often enough that they begin treating it like weather. It is not weather. It is structure. Interest expense is now one of the largest lines in the entire federal budget. 5 years earlier, the same bill was a fraction of that size in the source text. It went from roughly $345 billion to more than $1 trillion in about 5 years. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn-46, File 0 Fay, that kind of move changes the whole system because debt is tolerable only while the financing cost remains politically survivable. Once the interest itself begins eating the room that used to belong to everything else, the debt is no longer a background condition. It becomes the main character. That is where I think America is now. The debt is not just a number, it is the hidden author of the next decade. And once a country reaches that point, it begins lying to itself in more sophisticated ways. That is what I mean by fake stability, not total fabrication. That would be too easy to expose. Fake stability is more intelligent than that. It takes real numbers and arranges them in a flattering order. It takes a few genuine sources of strength and uses them to hide the weakness underneath. It takes selective growth and sells it as broad health. It takes optics and calls them fundamentals. The source document identifies 3 mechanisms that have been keeping the bluff alive. I think that is exactly the right word, a bluff. And like all good bluffs, it works only as long as most people do not insist on seeing the full hand. The first bluff is artificial intelligence spending. Now let me be very clear. The technology is real. The spending is real. The enthusiasm is real. I do not dismiss that, but I care much more about what the spending is doing to the statistics than what the headlines say it means. The source text points out that 5 leading American tech companies are expected to spend around $700 billion in 1 year on AI infrastructure, an amount comparable to the size of an entire national economy like Sweden. That spending flows into GDP and helps create the picture of healthy growth. But the same source also notes that much of the expensive hardware is imported, and imports subtract from GDP, meaning the domestic growth contribution is far smaller than the raw number suggests. When researchers adjusted for imports, AI's true contribution to domestic growth dropped dramatically to perhaps only a quarter of what the headline implied. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn-46, File 0 Fay, that is not a trivial footnote. That is the difference between signal and theater. If a number looks stronger because the visible spending is large, but the domestic economic benefit is much smaller than the public assumes, then the number is not a lie exactly. It is a flattering angle. And flattering angles are how fake stability works. The bluff looks bigger than the hand. Now add the second bluff, trade distortion. This one is almost comical in its honesty once you see it. Businesses rushed to import goods ahead of tariffs. That surge made GDP optics look weaker. Later, once tariffs landed and imports fell back, the optics improved. Same underlying economy. Different picture. That is not the economy healing. That is a measurement system giving you a better photograph because the furniture was moved. The source text says this plainly, and it matters because it reminds you how easily the public gets seduced by quarter-to-quarter presentation. Fay phylocyte, Fay turn 46, file 0 Fay nay comes the third signal. And this one is harder to laugh off. Growth itself weakening. The source document notes that fourth quarter 2025 GDP slowed to 1.4% annualized and the first quarter of 2026 went negative at minus 0.3%. The first negative quarter since early 2022. Fay phylocyte Fay turn 46. File 0 Fay, that is where the bluff starts showing. Because once growth weakens even while AI spending is roaring and trade optics are doing some of the cosmetic work, you have to ask a more serious question. If this is what the economy looks like while the props are still on stage, what does it look like when the props fail? That is the adult question. Now I want to turn from the headline economy to the actual lives inside it, because a country can perform stability at the top while ordinary people are already paying the bill. This is where the numbers become moral. Household debt in America reached $18.8 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2025, according to the source document, and credit card balances alone reached $1.277 trillion. Also a record Fay phylocyte, Fay turn 46, file 0 Fay. Again, people hear record too casually, so let me translate it. This means more families are financing ordinary life with expensive money. And the source text goes even further, noting that 55% of Americans carrying revolving credit card balances are using those balances for essentials such as food and utilities, while the average card rate sits above 22%. Fay phylocyte, Fay turn 46, file 0 Fay, that single fact tells you almost everything you need to know about the true condition of the middle and lower half of the country. When people are using credit cards not to fake status but to survive necessity. The economy is not fine. It may still be functioning. Functioning is not the same as fine. If a family is putting groceries on a 22% interest instrument, then the system has already crossed an important line. It has stopped being a system of prosperity and become a system of delay. Delay the pain, delay the shortfall, delay the recognition, delay the collapse of appearances. That is what the card becomes, not convenience. Time bought at a vicious price. The source text quotes a phrase I think is brutally accurate, financial triage, that is hospital language. And it belongs in this conversation because households are now triaging their own lives, which bill gets paid, which bill gets delayed, which pain becomes acceptable because the worst pain still has to be avoided. Fay phylocyte, Fay turn 46, file 0 Fay, that is not prosperity, that is battlefield budgeting, and it is happening underneath a headline economy that still wants to tell you the patient is mostly fine. Now let us move to student loans, because this is another place where the performance cracks. The source material gives one of the ugliest numbers in the entire file. Serious student. Loan delinquency went from 0.7% at the end of 2024 to 16.19% at the end of 2025. That is a more than 20-fold increase in 1 year, driven largely by the end of pandemic-era protections. By early 2026, about 1 in 4 student loan borrowers was delinquent, roughly triple the pre-pandemic rate. Fay phylocyte, Fay turn 46, file 0 Fay. That number is not a side detail, that is a generational message. It says a large slice of younger Americans entered adulthood carrying education debt, were temporarily shielded, then reintroduced to the real payment structure in an economy where housing is unaffordable. Borrowing costs are high, and job growth is far less healthy than the public story suggests. That is not a launch pad. That is a trapdoor. And if you wonder why so many younger households feel financially old before they have even accumulated anything, that statistic is one answer. Now let us talk about jobs, because the public still believes jobs are the anchor. If jobs are strong, people say the rest can be managed. That is true only if the job market is actually strong. The source document is very precise here. February 2026 produced a loss of 92,000 jobs against forecasts for a gain. Unemployment climbed to 4.5%. Job growth had gone negative in 5 of the prior 9 months. And growth forecasts for the second half of the year were sliding toward what Goldman Sachs described as stall speed. Fay file site Fayturn 46 file 0 Fay. Now, stall speed is a beautiful phrase because it sounds technical and harmless. It is not harmless. Stall speed means the plane is still in the air, but not by enough margin to make you calm. One ugly turn, and the whole relationship changes. The source also notes that unemployment for Americans aged 16 to 24 stayed above 10% for 6 straight months, and that small business revenue expectations and hiring expectations both deteriorated badly. Fay file site Fayturn 46 file 0 Fay that matters enormously. Because youth unemployment is not just a youth problem, it is a leading signal about how hard the system is finding it to create new absorptive capacity. And small businesses matter because they are not theory. They are the actual local economy. A frozen labor market is one of the most deceptive conditions in economics. It can look stable because layoffs remain low. But the source makes the key point: hiring has essentially frozen, and the break-even monthly job growth number needed just to keep unemployment from rising has fallen dramatically. The bar moved, the economy did not get stronger. The measurement got easier to satisfy. Fay file site Fayturn 46 file 0 Fay, that is fake stability again, not false data. A misleading interpretation of what the data really means. Now let me tell you where the entire picture becomes morally offensive. The K-shape. The source text uses the phrase K-shaped economy, citing New York Fed researchers. The top of the K rises while the bottom falls. Wealthier households enjoy rising portfolio values and home values, while middle and lower income households carry record debt at record rates and increasingly use credit to maintain basic consumption. Fay file site Fayturn 46 file 0 Fay, that is one of the cleanest frameworks available for understanding modern America. Same country, same markets, same politicians, same television, 2 economies at the top: asset ownership, financial resilience, and enough buffer to convert inflation into inconvenience rather than emergency. At the bottom, debt, rent, fragile employment, and the lived experience of an economy that is not cooling, but becoming harder to survive. This is why elite narratives often sound insane to ordinary people, because elite narratives are often drawn from the top arm of the K and then projected downward as if the whole nation shared the same experience. It does not. A family with a large stock portfolio, a fixed-rate mortgage locked in at 3%, and significant home equity can experience 2026 as discomfort. A family using a credit card for groceries experiences 2026 as attrition. Those are not the same country emotionally. Nowhere is that split clearer than in housing. The source document notes that home prices nationally rose about 50% since 2020, while incomes rose only about 29% over the same period. The gap between those two numbers is the affordability crisis. Add 30-year mortgage rates around 6.3% to 6.5%, and the monthly payment on a $400,000 mortgage rises by roughly $500 a month versus the 3% world of 2021. Fay file site Fayturn 46 file 0 Fay. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between possibility and exclusion for a huge part of the population. People keep talking about housing as though it were just an asset class. Housing is not merely an asset class. It is the main middle-class wealth machine, the foundation of family formation, and the place where the fiction of normal life either remains available or starts disappearing. When young households cannot afford entry, and existing owners are locked in place because giving up their old mortgage would be financially foolish, the housing market stops functioning as a mobility engine. It becomes a museum. The source notes homebuilder confidence at 38, below the expansion threshold of 50 for nearly 2 years. Fay file site Fayturn 46 file 0 Fay. That is not a normal market clearing itself. That is paralysis. And paralysis is one of the hallmarks of systems entering a fake stability phase. Everything still exists. Everything still trades. Everything still gets measured. But the social function underneath begins disappearing. Now let us talk about recession risk, because this is where polite denial becomes harder. The source text cites Moody's recession model, which has correctly preceded every recession since 1945, each time it crossed the 50% threshold, and it says the model sat at 49%, in early 2026. J.P. Morgan put recession odds at 35%. Goldman Sachs at 30%. Bank of America said recession risks were underpriced. Consumer sentiment fell to 53.3 in March 2026, a level historically associated with recessionary conditions. 40% of Americans told pollsters they believed an economic collapse was coming. Filocyte Turn 46 File 0 that cluster matters more than any one number on its own, because economics is partly arithmetic and partly expectation. When enough households believe trouble is coming, they alter behavior in ways that help create the trouble. They delay purchases, they hoard liquidity, they stop taking risk, they hire less, they spend less, they become more careful, exactly when the system most needed them to remain casual. That is how sentiment becomes structural, and it is why fake stability can snap so quickly once belief itself starts weakening. Now, I want to say the one thing that, in my view, makes this cycle more dangerous than 2008 in one specific sense. In 2008, the country still had balance sheet room. That does not mean 2008 was easy. It was not. It means the federal government still possessed much more credible capacity to borrow hard, spend hard, rescue hard, and carry the cost later without the interest burden itself already devouring the budget. The source document puts this plainly through the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. America is almost certain to enter the next shock more indebted than ever before, which may significantly hamper its ability to mount an appropriate response. The projected federal deficit for 2026 is around $1.9 trillion, growing much larger over the coming decade while interest payments already claim the first check. Filocyte Turn 46 File 0 that is the real danger. When the next serious crack opens, the government will want to respond the way it has learned to respond over the last 15 years, borrow more, support more, promise more, stabilize more. The problem is that stabilization itself now carries a much heavier price because the carrying cost of prior stabilization is already huge. That is why the safety net is weaker than people think. It still exists on paper, but it no longer has the same elasticity, and this is the core of the fake stability economy. The nation is using the language of a strong system while standing on the balance sheet of a much more brittle one that is not permanent. Now, does this mean collapse tomorrow? I am not in the business of pretending the calendar is simple. It is not. Systems can perform stability longer than critics expect. Households can absorb pain longer than outsiders imagine. Governments can stretch confidence surprisingly far, but that is not a reason to sleep. It is a reason to prepare intelligently. Because what matters is not whether the bluff breaks next month or in 18 months. What matters is whether you are positioned like someone who believed the performance or like someone who studied the hand. That is the question. If your life depends entirely on the cheerful version of the story, then you are taking a kind of macro risk most people do not even realize they are taking. If your household has no liquidity, high variable rate debt, no flexibility, a stretched housing or rental burden, and total dependence on the next paycheck continuing indefinitely, then you are more exposed to the real economy than the headlines admit. That is not doom language. That is structure language. Now let me say something to the person who is already tired. The point of seeing this clearly is not to terrify yourself. It is to stop lying to yourself. That is a very different emotional posture. If the economy were truly broad-based healthy, you could afford more casualness. If the debt burden were ordinary, if interest expense were manageable, if household balance sheets were cleaner, if housing were accessible, if youth employment were stronger, if credit cards were not financing essentials, if student debt were not breaking borrowers on re-entry, if small businesses were optimistic, if sentiment were robust, if recession indicators were distant, then yes, a more relaxed stance might make sense. But that is not the world described by the file you gave me. This is a world of selective strength covering broad erosion, so the better response is not panic, it is realism. Reduce the forms of fragility you control. Do not worship debt. Respect liquidity. Be honest about housing costs. Be more careful about variable rate exposure. Do not confuse rising stock indexes with broad social health. Remember that markets can keep partying long after households begin bleeding. And most of all, understand that the official story is not the same thing as the underlying condition. That distinction alone can save people years of denial. Now let me end where I think the truth becomes simplest. The American economy in 2026 is not one thing. It is a split screen on one side, high-end asset ownership, AI enthusiasm, resilient equity markets, and enough institutional confidence to keep the surface calm. On the other, record federal debt, $1 trillion annual interest bill, record household debt, essential spending on credit cards, student loan distress, frozen hiring, housing exclusion, collapsing consumer confidence, and recession models standing one notch below explicit warning. That is not stability. That is performance. And performances end in one of two ways. Either the actors keep getting paid to hold the stage together, or the audience finally stops believing the script. So here is the final choice. You can keep telling yourself the same story. Most people on television still want to tell that the numbers look mostly fine. The system is broadly under control, and whatever pain exists is isolated, manageable, and temporary. Many people will keep doing exactly that. Or you can do the harder thing. You can study the debt, study the interest, study the household strain, study the hiring freeze, study the K-shape, study the housing trap, study the recession signals. And once you see the structure clearly, you can build your own household as if the stage set is not the same thing as the foundation under it. That is the better way to think. Not because it is cheerful, because it is useful. And in a fake stability economy, usefulness is worth far more than reassurance.